Thursday, we are administering what's called the HSA, the Holistic Student Assessment, and unfortunately, social studies classes got dinged this year as the class that's going to be administered. The HSA is basically a survey that the school does K through 12 or 7 through 12, where they're going to ask you about the school climate and your experiences here in school, your experience as a student. So a portion of the class, maybe all of the class on Thursday in class, will be devoted to that. What we don't spend on that HSA, and you can use Chromebooks, you can use my Chromebooks that day. What we don't spend, we'll hop right back into our lesson. Yesterday, the take-home test for this week, I will hand out on Friday. They'll be due Monday. As I said yesterday, this is the shortest of, I think, the first half of the year's chapters. There's not a lot of reading in this chapter, and I'm going to try to get through all the notes, all the PowerPoint this week, even though we're losing a class to the HSA on Thursday. So if you're home today and you're watching at home, try to keep up on the lessons that I'm recording. I posted last night's class, yesterday's class on there. And I'm going to do that every class, even if there's no absence, because some students benefit from being able to go back and hear what was covered in class. So I'm going to do that as a force of habit. If I don't happen to record at the start, one of you guys in the front, just remind me, give me a little nudge to hit the record button on that. So what else we got going on this week? We got the HSA on Thursday. We've got a vocab quiz on Friday on Chapter 3. I'm meeting with Mrs. Analik tomorrow to go over your class that you had with her last Friday. And when you come to class on Friday this week, if you could bring with you the sheet that I handed out when I did the SCOTUS assignment, the sheet that has the fill-in page on the bottom for your rough draft due date. You guys familiar with that sheet? Let's bring that to class on Friday so we can fill that in. I'll have your rough draft due dates due and your final draft dates due. I think I gave you your order. Everybody picked a number. You just didn't get your final date yet, correct? All right. So more to come on that. Yesterday we were talking in class about the shape of early America, and we left off discussing how most of the early settlers in the Americas, come to the New World from the British Isles, okay? And we closed class with refuting the standard, I don't want to call it a lie as much as it was misinformation that we learned in our childhood, at least in my childhood. I don't know how well it's been corrected since I was a student, but when I was a kid in your shoes, especially middle school, 13, 14 years old, the impression was kind of that Columbus discovered America. He was the first to arrive and meet the Indians in the Caribbean, the Native Americans in the Caribbean, but he did not set foot on America proper. He did not set foot on what we call the upper 48 today. It had been inhabited for a long time before any European arrived in the colonies. So just with that in mind, let's just take a peek at get this out of the way so people can see at home. Native Americans had actually been here for thousands of years, hunting, cultivating, in many cases destroying the territory in ways worse than the colonists could imagine. We said yesterday that the population doubled between 1750 and 1775 to over 2.5 million. And we talked a lot about the birth rate and the mortality rate yesterday. And we talked about how women married earlier, and that resulted in usually 1 to 2 more children born throughout the course of their lifetime in the colonies. All right, what do you need, Corey? What do you need? Push.
I was just coming to ask if you had any cups.
Any cups?
Yeah.
I don't have any cups, man.
All right.
I'm sorry. Okay. At the settling of the colonies, single men perform much of the labor, okay, to get the colony started. And that's only because single men made up the bulk of the people who were arriving. All right. During this time, men outnumbered women 2 to 1. Once the colony started to become successful, once the colony was established, once there was a cash crop, once there was the starving time ended and the colony was stabilized, okay, the ratio between male and female is going to begin to even out. And that makes sense because as the colony settled, as the men are settling the colony and making sure that it's sturdy and durable, what's going to follow are more and more women and more families. The higher number of women in the British colonies compared to the Spanish or French colonies helped the British colonies' populations to grow quickly. Big difference between Spanish and French colonies and the British colonies is that the British colonies were sending family units over, and it's going to result in population population growth happening much more quickly than you're going to see with either the French or the Spanish. We know that the Spanish didn't really come here with family members. They didn't really even come here to settle. They came here to get rich, and they came here to convert who? They came here to convert who to Catholicism? The Spanish, Native American Indians. Okay. As more non-English immigrants move to the colonies, nativism will increase. And nativism is an important vocab term. Who can tell me what nativism is? Okay. Nativism. Michael, any idea?
It says anti-immigrant sentiment.
Yeah, nativism is exactly that. It's basically the idea that we don't want people coming from other places. Okay? We don't want people coming from other places. As non-English immigrants start to come to the colonies, people from what is today Germany, okay, other parts of Europe, the English colonists are like, whoa, time out. This is irony of ironies here. This is our neck of the woods, they're starting to say. This is we got this marketplace covered. How dare you come to America? We are the settlers here. So this attitude of superiority for groups that are not English is going to be very, very prevalent in the colonies, both in the early colonial period and moving on through the 20th century. Okay, up until people are coming here, after World War I. Okay, and beyond. There's still a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment among Americans. Not to confuse, because I think there's a difference. There's a huge difference between people not wanting any immigrants to come to the United States today, and those people that want to make sure that people who come here are coming here legally and abiding by our immigration laws. I think those are two different animals. But the point I'm trying to make is, for as long as we've been a group of colonies, and for as long as the United States has been in existence, since 1776 and beyond, there has been periods of time where anti-immigrant sentiment, anti-immigrant ideas are going to be pushed and they're going to be espoused. But I just don't want you confusing necessarily the idea that opposition to illegal immigration is the same as what we're talking about here. It's not. People who came during the colonial period who weren't English were not welcomed by the English just because they weren't English. It didn't matter whether they were coming here legally or not. They were not welcome here because they weren't light-skinned and they didn't speak the King's English. Okay, that idea of nativism is going to be very, very prevalent, and it's going to be prevalent over religious ideas too. Okay, we know that the Puritans in New England. How about this? The Puritans come here so they can practice their religion and not be persecuted. And what do when they arrive here?
Not allow anyone to practice.
They close off their communities to anybody who's not a practicing Puritan, who does not practice the same religious beliefs. So there's some irony there. We'll talk more about that as we move forward. All right, let's go to our next slide. Actually, there's a quick video clip on this slide I want to play, and hopefully this will shine through for our students at home, and they'll be able to hear this as well as see it.
Demography involves the study of populations and how the dynamics of population growth change over time. The demography of colonial America was very interesting. Initially, the colonists, when they first arrived, had the very difficult challenge of creating settlements and creating a self-sustaining economy, and in the midst of that, they often fell victim to disease or warfare. But after that so-called starving time ended, the American colonies grew dramatically in population. One reason was that they had a higher birth rate and a lower death rate than was the case in Europe. That was largely because the average age of the colonists was much lower than that in Europe, which meant that women had a much longer time to have babies, and many of them had 7, 8, 10, 12 children over time. And as the colonies grew, they became more secure and less susceptible to disease. And as a result, the population grew dramatically, so that during the 18th century, the American population was doubling every 25 years. And by the time of the Revolution, it was well over 1 million people.
All right, on that topic of population growth, well, we'll revisit that and we'll go on to our next slide. Let's take a peek at the slide that's going to address the condition for women in the colonies. A lot to talk about with respect to women. And again, we're talking about primarily here the English colonies, okay? The English colonies, we're going to talk about what was considered the domestic sphere, okay? We're going to talk about the fact that women had limited rights in the colonies. We're going to talk about what was considered women's work in quotations. And we're also going to talk about women and religion. An irony, actually surprising to me when I learned this when I was in college, who attended church services more frequently during this period in the colonies? You think it was men or you think it was women? It was women. Women were the touchstones. They were the cornerstones of the New England colonial churches. Women were oftentimes the leaders, at least in attendance, if not in church leadership. They were really what made churches successful. And that surprised me initially. You would think that church life, especially churches that were almost exclusively run by men, would be male-dominated in terms of attendance. That was not the case. More on that in a moment. Let's talk about the caption or the picture here first. This is called the first, second, and last scene of mortality, and it's a needlework from about 1776 that shows the domestic path from cradle to coffin, followed by most affluent colonial women. Affluent meaning well-to-do or well-off. If you look at this, you've got basically all of the roles that a woman is going to play in the colonial period, all in this needlework. And over here on the left-hand side, you see the casket, really from cradle to grave, the things that women were going to endure in the colonies. And almost everyone in colonial times worked hard throughout their lives, especially women, okay? Especially women. The number of hats that women wore during this period is remarkable. And what is also remarkable is the success and the ability in which they were able to accomplish what they accomplished without getting hardly any fanfare, without having any rights in most segments of society, and without having any of the legal protections that white males are going to have in colonial American society. The liberty and freedom that existed in the colonies did not apply equally to women. Talk about a couple of the simple ones. Women's property that they brought to a marriage. If a woman was fortunate enough to own property or have money when she entered into a marriage, the moment she says, "I do," the moment, literally, the justice or the priest says, "I now pronounce you husband and wife," that property and those funds legally became the property of the husband, whether the husband had had anything to do with her accumulating that wealth. Now, that is not to say that the husband would steal But under the eyes of the law, if a woman brought property that she owned on her own to a marriage, in a legal sense, that property was his. Okay, is that the way it is today? Hell no. Okay, absolutely not. Women, American women, were forced to abide by the European custom of deferring to their husbands. Okay, deferring to their husbands, meaning they were expected to take a step back or behind their husband in all aspects of life, whether that political life, social life, okay, public life. Women were expected to take a back seat. This was a European tradition that carried over. Remember, we said that when colonists came to the Americas, they weren't just bringing their clothing, they weren't just bringing their animals, they weren't just bringing their family, they were bringing their religious beliefs, they were bringing their customs, their mores, their traditions. All these things are being transported to the New World. So it's really not a surprise. Europe was a society largely dominated at this time by males, and that is going to follow suit across the Atlantic. Circumstances are going to vary by colony, but most women did not have suffrage, meaning what? Couldn't vote. When we talk about suffrage rights, we're talking about voting rights. Good. They could not participate in government. They were not allowed to attend schools, and they had limited rights. I do not want to equate the plight of American women to that of African American slaves, but I will tell you this. If there was a hierarchy of rights in society, at the bottom would be African American slaves, because typically they would be slaves for life and they would have no rights. Slightly above African American slaves in terms of rights and privileges in society would be American women. Okay, at this time, American women had very few legal protections. Okay, they were not allowed to attend schools. They had no legal rights. Divorces were very rarely granted. The textbook made mention of that. The only way a divorce would be granted if a woman brought a divorce case was if there was some type of, and even this was not always guaranteed, if there was some type of situation where the woman's physical life was in danger. A husband could legally beat his wife, and as long as the beating did not result in some type of homicide, the woman would have very few legal protections. A wife could not sign a contract if she was married. She would not have the ability to sign a legal contract in most colonies. If there was a divorce and there were children involved, regardless of the circumstances, rights to the custody of the children almost always would follow the male in the marriage. Women had very, very few legal protections, and it's important that we recognize that. Also, in colonial times, the stereotypical role of the females was to maintain the household. Okay, maintain the household, to include house gardens and fields, while the males worked outside of the home in any type of capacity, whether it be a merchant, whether it be a professional, whether it be a hunter or a farmer. Women performed a variety of work throughout their lives. Often, unmarried women worked as servants or hired help in other households to learn skills for when they were eventually married. Any type of education that a woman obtained, informal education in the colonies, was really designed to help her attract what, do you think? Who said it? Yeah. Any type of education that a woman received in the colonies was designed to help her when she became married. And that's why many single women would work in other homes or as servants to people in the community. Overall, though, some young women were apprenticed to learn skills trades. Not very many, though. Overall, women's work varied based on geographic location, socioeconomic status, and race or ethnicity. If you were a young married couple, okay, and you had a couple of acres of land that you farmed, it would not be uncommon to see a woman out in the field tending the field with her husband. Okay, if a family was more established and the husband and the wife had money and they had a nice property, then the woman's roles might be more relegated to staying in the home and maintaining the home, raising the children, preparing meals. okay, providing for what little formal education, informal education that children would receive. So women's roles were very sharply defined in the colonies. And as we read in our text, Anne Hutchinson, what did Anne Hutchinson dare to do? A couple of you missed this. Remember, you missed this question in your take-home test. Anne Hutchinson, what did she do that that caused her great heartburn among males in her colony?
She was like preaching to like groups, and then the groups got bigger, and she was kind of like doing like a male minister.
Heaven forbid she was acting as a teacher of scripture. She was serving in the capacity as a minister. She would hold Bible meetings in her home where she spoke in public in front of other people, including men, and the men, they were astounded at this, at the nerve of this woman. This was a lot of the attitudes. Public speaking was not considered a woman's domain. Public speaking, those of you that are comfortable speaking in public, male or female of you, just understand that public speaking was taboo for women during the colonial period. It was seen as a domain that was outside of the realm of not just their intelligence, but outside of the realm of their responsibilities. Okay, women were expected to focus on particular tasks. It was a male-dominated society, and women were very, very strongly encouraged to focus on what were called domestic tasks or women's work. Now, one area, and your text is great in pointing this out, the one area where we're going to see women, okay, have a little bit more weight in society, okay, was in the church. Although, as in other parts of life, women were expected to remain submissive to male authority in church, they made up the majority of church members, okay, by the 18th century. Now, there's reasons this is probably the case. Since women were responsible for raising the children, primarily in the home, there was a belief, certainly among mothers, that they had to set an example for their children. Okay, and this is most likely why colonial women, I almost said American women, we are not America yet in 1607 or in 1750. We are still British colonies, but colonial women probably felt that they needed to set an example for their children, and they were very dutiful in their religious instructions. And to be honest, they were dutiful because they had to be. Okay? Remember, church attendance in most colonies, especially New England colonies, was what? Huh?
High.
Why was it high? You are right. Why?
Because most of the people from Europe come for religious freedoms.
A lot came for religious freedom, but if you're a New England Puritan and you live in Puritan, Massachusetts, is church attendance optional or is church attendance mandatory? You have to attend services. And if you don't, they're taking names and they're marking down who's here and who's not. So women took their religious lives very, very seriously. All right. Religious worship and participation seems to have been important to these individuals. Women who came as captives from Africa often tried to sustain their own religious beliefs and practices, including the leadership roles that some had as priests and cult leaders in Africa. African women who came here as slaves are going to further their religious beliefs also. Many will convert to Christianity once they arrive or once they get settled in their life as a slave. Many will continue their own religious traditions in private. Okay? But women are going to play an important role in the growth and the proliferation, the explosion in religious beliefs during the colonial period. I think there's a video on this slide that I want to share before we move on. There is at the top.
The European colonists who migrated to the Americas in the 16th and 17th centuries brought with them stereotypical notions about the inferiority of women in European society. That meant that in the colonies, women were relegated to the traditional roles that they had occupied in Europe, that is, primarily wives and mothers. Colonial families usually had large numbers of children. Over a dozen was quite common. At the same time, women.
All right, here's where Farley wants to chime in with an important point. Okay, author's talking about women being relegated to certain roles. Absolutely true. Relegated meaning they're basically forced into lives of domestic servants, housekeepers, raising the children, uh, doing housework, being mothers. All those things, by the way, are not bad things. There are plenty of women, modern times, who are joyful over becoming mothers. They're joyful over raising their children. They're joyful over maintaining a wonderful home. But what's different between now and the colonial era is that women did not have the what? They didn't have the choice, or the choices that they are able to exhibit today. They don't have the choices. So that's an important distinction. Women were limited in their choices. This is no means on my part, or I even think on our author's part, to diminish those accomplishments. Motherhood is a wonderful thing. Maintaining a home, if that is your choice, is a wonderful thing as a woman or a man. Okay, but the author's pointing out that women did not have the freedom in this period to make those choices. It was laid at their feet, and they were expected, without questioning, without putting up a fuss, to accept those roles in society.
Were expected to be helpmates to their husbands, dealing with all of the domestic duties, including farm work, at the same time that they were dutiful wives and caring mothers. In addition, however, the colonies and the environment in the colonies provided unexpected opportunities for women to break out of those traditional domestic roles. For example, the high death rate in the early years of colonization meant that many women had to assume control of a farm or a business. Women were especially prominent in the operation of taverns and inns, places of accommodation. So while traditional attitudes toward women dominated in the colonies, there were exceptional opportunities for at least some women to exercise their independence and be the equals, especially economically, of men.
Those opportunities would come, for example, if a husband would pass and the wife would become a widow. If the husband owned a tavern, or the husband had a 500-acre plantation, or the husband owned a large farm in the Northeast, and he had no heirs of age, guess who inherits? Mrs. And Mrs. has an opportunity at that point to strut her stuff, to blossom, to show, to give evidence that she's absolutely capable of doing up until then what she had been what? Forbidden to do. Forbidden to do. So when opportunity, and here's the wonderful thing about women in the colonies, when opportunity arose, there are plenty of historical examples to point to where women jumped at the chance once they were given an opportunity. I mean, we can look at that even today. There are more women lawyers today. There are more women doctors. There are more women professionals, not because women are smarter in 2023 or not because women are more capable, but because women now have the what? The rights, the opportunities to accomplish those things. These women had the opportunity. These women had the abilities. These women had the capability. All that they were denied was the precious opportunity. And we're going to see that once women are given an opportunity, even in limited numbers, women are going to take the ball and run with it. They're really going to flourish, and they're going to set an example. They're going to they'll become a beacon for other women. Okay, as few as they were, they're going to become a beacon. One of those women, I have a video that I want to share with you, and I think we do have time for today. Let's just questions on any of this before we move on. Okay, let's look at the next slide on Eliza Pinckney, and after we talk a little bit about Miss Pinckney, I have a short video clip on her life. This is a dress. This is a picture of a dress. This rare sack back gown made of 18th century silk has been restored and displayed in Charleston, South Carolina. This is a dress. It belonged to Eliza Lucas Pinckney. We talk about Charleston. We mentioned Charleston yesterday. One of the five biggest cities in the colonies, behind Philadelphia, behind Boston, behind New York, behind Newport, Rhode Island. We've got Charleston. Eliza Pinckney is going to be an example of one of those women that we were just talking about. She lived from 1722 to 1793, and she provides an example of a wealthy woman whose life circumstances and decisions allowed her to take on a social and economic leadership outside the household or her domestic sphere. She was wealthy. She was a woman of privilege by all accounts, and certainly among women of her own time. Her social and economic class, experiences in the West Indies, and education in England all helped prepare her to manage 3 plantations, including overseeing slaves, okay, and care for her ailing mother and sister. She continued to manage her plantations after her marriage to Charles Pinckney, and after his death, added his plantations to her load. She is best known for her experiments that led to the ability of South Carolina to become rich from the growth of indigo. Indigo is a plant, more like a weed, that produces a beautiful blue dye that was very, very prominent in coloring uniforms for soldiers. And this woman, Eliza Lucas Pinckney, she is one of these women that, white women, who are going to be pointed to as an example of what women can accomplish if only they had that precious opportunity. She was a South Carolinian, married to a wealthy individual. Let's take a look at her life. Short video clip on her life. I'm hoping these videos are working at home, students. I think they are. Eliza Lucas Pinckney, where are you hiding? Here we go.
South Carolina ETV and Junior Achievement present Legacy of Leadership with Jim Welch.
At the beginning of the 18th century, when Eliza Lucas Pinckney was a girl, agriculture was still thought of as an art, but it was quickly taking on the earmarks of science. Experimentation was the hallmark of the South Carolina planter. New crops were tried, new seeds were imported on sailing ships and tested in Carolina soil. In many ways, each and every planter was a pioneer in agriculture science, for agriculture was the foundation of the colonial South Carolina economy. At the young age of 16, Eliza, the daughter of Captain George Lucas, governor of Antigua, was put in charge of her father's 3 plantations in the Carolinas when her father returned to his duties in the West Indies. Indigo, a plant prized for the high-quality blue dye derived from its leaves, had been cultivated in the colony as early as 1741, but without success. Eliza determined to try her hand with seeds sent from her father's plantations in the West Indies. For 3 years, she experimented in planting the indigo seed. Even in the rich Carolina soil, indigo was not easy to cultivate, and the first and second crops failed. The third crop finally bore seed. The seed ripened, and she then began work on the delicate and difficult curing process. To get the best color, the leaves had to be cut at exactly the right moment, and then put into a great vat and covered with water. The fermented liquid then was drawn off into another vat, where it was beaten with paddles to thicken. Then it was drawn into a third vat, where it was allowed to settle, and the sediment dried into lumps or cakes for shipment. Eliza's first attempts at this curing process were thwarted by the overseer she had hired to help her in the process, who deliberately sabotaged her efforts in an attempt to discourage the growing of indigo in the Carolinas, so that their native island of Montserrat could continue unchallenged as a main producer of indigo. When Eliza discovered this, she immediately dismissed him and took over the process herself. Within a few years, the growing of indigo was a thriving industry for the province of Carolina. The impact of indigo on the Carolina economy was enormously important. Carolina indigo yielded a dye far superior to any other produced, and thus demanded higher prices from foreign markets. In fact, historian Edward McGrady wrote that indigo proved more beneficial to Carolina than the mines of Mexico or Peru were to Spain. The source of this great wealth was the result of an experiment by a mere girl. This mere girl was destined for greatness in other ways as well. In 1744, she married Colonel Charles Pinckney and settled into a rewarding period where she could indulge her love of gardening and agriculture at their plantation home, Belmont, and the excitement of city life at their townhouse in Charleston. Their two sons, Charles Cotesworth Pinckney and Thomas Pinckney, became national figures during the American Revolution. Charles Cotesworth Pinckney was an author and signer of the United States Constitution and delegate to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. Thomas Pinckney was a Revolutionary War officer, a governor of South Carolina from 1787 to 1789, and later the United States Minister to Spain and Great Britain. In 1758, Pinckney died of fever, leaving Eliza alone to manage the vast Pinckney plantations and properties. Sadly, the British burned Belmont during the American Revolution, and Eliza then moved to her widowed daughter Harriet Ory's plantation on the Santee River, Hampton. Here she experienced one of the proudest moments of her life when she personally received newly elected President George Washington during his triumphant tour of the southern states. It was during his visit to Hampton that Washington remarked on the particular beauty of a singular oak tree which remains known today as the Washington oak. In 1793, Eliza fell ill, apparently suffering from cancer. She was taken to Philadelphia for treatment, and there she died shortly thereafter. Among the prominent men who carried Eliza's body to its rest in the Philadelphia churchyard, and who was there at his own request, was George Washington. Eliza Lucas Pinckney's determination and unfailing efforts brought success both to her family and her country. This remarkable individual left a legacy of achievement that remains undiminished by the centuries.
All right, there we have it. We finished on Eliza Pinckney. We'll pick up tomorrow. Did I return quizzes and tests today?
Yes.
Okay, and I got attendance. We're just missing Alex.
Maddox, and Jessica.
You guys have a good night.